Good afternoon and welcome to Comcare's Mental Health Community of Practice. I'm Martin Horrocks, the Director of the Mental Health and Research Team in Comcare's Strategic Partnership Engagement Group, and I'll be your host for today's event. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are virtually meeting today. I'm in Brisbane, so I would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Jagera people, the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to Indigenous Australians and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present and emerging, to acknowledge the contribution they make to this nation, and I extend that respect to all Indigenous Australians and Torres Strait Islander people attending this event. Today's event is an opportunity to reflect on our experiences over the last 2 years and to consider how the challenges we faced and the changes we made will affect the way in which workplace mental health is promoted and protected in the future. Some workplace leaders were supporting workers in lockdown, many of whom felt isolated from their usual workplace support networks, whereas others dealt with the challenging task of not only protecting the physical health of essential workers, but also supporting their mental health and wellbeing. There are many of you online today, and we thank you for taking the time out of your day to participate in this mental health community of practice. For those of you who have not attended a Comcare event before, welcome. We hope today's session is enjoyable and provides you with some valuable insights and learnings that you can take back to your workplace. If you have attended a mental health community of practice event before, welcome back. You might note that today's event is a bit different. Today we'll be going to hear about the experiences of two organisations that are in the Comcare scheme jurisdiction. We will hear from Kim Brady of Australia Post and Dr. Laura Kirby of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, before Professor Kimberly Norris helps us reflect on the challenges we faced and how we adapted to the new normal, how best to go forward, taking on board key learnings from the pandemic. Thank you to those who have already sent through questions during the registration process. We will have some time at the conclusion of Professor Norris's presentation for Q&A. If you'd like, you can submit a question via the chat function, which is accessed by clicking the question mark menu icon on the top right corner of your screen. Before we begin, Sue Weston, PSM, Comcare's CEO, would like to say a few words. Thank you, Sue.
Thanks so much, Martin, and good afternoon, everyone. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands we're meeting on today. I'm on Ngunnawal country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be here today. Welcome, everyone. This is our 9th Mental Health Community of Practice. We've been running these events now for 5 years, and they continue to grow in importance and popularity among the diverse range of employers and employees in our scheme, APS agencies and licensees alike. We've got more than 120 delegates registered to attend from Commonwealth agencies and licensees nationally. So it's clear that creating and maintaining mentally healthy workplaces continues to be a priority for our scheme employers. The community of practice is an important part of our mental health program, and we'll continue to deliver these events to help employers minimise the risk to psychological health and create work environments that are mentally healthy. The theme for today is post-COVID learnings for the workplace, and it is the ideal time to discuss this important topic. I'm not sure we are quite post-COVID yet, but as 2021 comes to a close, workplace leaders should be thinking ahead and considering how they will support staff wellbeing while adopting or adapting to a post-COVID way of working. We have a great lineup of speakers today, including the University of Tasmania's Professor Kimberly for the keynote address. And it's also great to see two representatives of our Comcare licensees, Australia Post and the Commonwealth Bank, and I thank them for sharing their experience. So thank you, Kim and Laura, for joining us today. As a workplace leader, there have been so many different experiences to observe during this pandemic and to be part of. And one of the key areas I've been watching is work design. We've had the big move of the workplace to home and back to the office and home, and perhaps some of you have had quite a few more than just that. We've had a seismic shift in attitudes about working from home along with the technology to deliver this and the capability of people to use the technology. One giant leap all at once. We've had people giving careful thought about whether permanent work from home for some is sensible. How do you overcome isolation and participate in sharing knowledge? We've had to manage the blurring of the work and the home divide, trying to make the lines a bit cleaner. Desk arrangements, where the hot desks are a thing of the past, or can they work even better with people working some days at home and some days working at work and not requiring a desk all week? Outcomes-based work has also had a big push along, with some of you having responsibility for homeschooling as well as work. And for some of you, there has been an enormous effort at work to support parts of the community that have needed assistance. Certainly a lot of change impacting on work design. And it's been interesting to be a part of this and observe this simultaneously. And I'm not sure we have all the answers yet. And I look forward to hearing the thoughts of our presenters today on this interesting theme. So back to you, Martin.
Thank you, Sue. I'd like now to introduce our first speaker, Kim Grady. Kim is the Head of Safety, Wellbeing and Governance at Australia Post, and her portfolio includes leading the enterprise psychological health and wellbeing strategy for an extended workforce of approximately 80,000 people, with a clear focus on care and connection. Kim is a risk management professional with 17 years experience in legal and operational roles, primarily specialising in work health and safety. Kim is kindly going to share with us how Australia Post has supported its frontline essential workers' wellbeing whilst they were coping with the uncertainty of continuing to work through a pandemic and being faced with enormous increases in volumes of parcels. Please welcome Kim.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Very good. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me today. It's lovely to be part of this group and speaking to you all a little bit about how we looked after particularly our frontline team members through the pandemic. I think we've done a lot of work across all of the different types of our employees and extended workforce, from posties and drivers and post office staff and call centre staff, sales teams, our support teams. But today, just in the short time that we have together, I'm going to focus a little bit more on our posties and on our retail staff in the post offices. So I would be surprised if anyone on this call hasn't had something to do with Australia Post over the last couple of years, because the pandemic for us has been an extraordinary time on a number of different levels. As I talk to you this week, we are frantically trying to get on top of deliveries from the Black Friday and Cyber Monday sales. We are expecting this week to probably tip over 13.5 million parcels this week. We may hit 14. To give you a bit of context, as I joined Australia Post in August of 2019, and in our Christmas peak period in 2019, we delivered just over 9 million parcels, and that was a huge Australia Post record, 9 million. This week, we're expecting to deliver nearly 14. And we have not dropped below 9 million parcels in many, many, many weeks. So it's been a huge time of change and transition for our team members and for the whole business in the context of everything else that we've all been dealing with over the last almost 2 years. And I would certainly agree with Sue when I think we're not quite post-COVID yet, although the challenges we're facing at this end of the game look different. But I think the protective factors and the approach that we've put in place in terms of managing our protecting our people's well-being will serve us well as we move forward into the next phase, whatever that might look like. And we all know in the last week we're starting to wonder exactly what that might look like. But Sandra, I might ask you to flick onto that first substantive slide. Thank you. Our program, our Keeping Connected and Well program, is really founded in in the integrated model. So in Tony Lamontagne's integrated approach to workplace mental health, and we look across the continuum. So we are absolutely really interested in making sure that we provide support for our people that may be on the left-hand side of that spectrum at any given time, but equally it's really important that we are creating an environment that allows our people to sit further to the right as often as they can in that flourishing and mental wellness space. I don't know about you guys, but I have certainly moved up and down that spectrum at different points throughout the last 2 years. You know, and I think reflecting personally, it's probably the last couple of months that I've found myself a little bit further towards the left as I've come out of the crisis management and adrenaline rush of managing the Delta variant and everything that came along with that. I have found myself relying a little bit more on some of the resources that we've got in place around that languishing space and more getting myself back into the promote space. So being able to move up and down that spectrum when you need to as an individual and as a leader and as somebody who looks after this strategy across the organisation and speak about that transparently and authentically, I think is really important. So if I talk through sort of what we focused on in terms of our Keeping Connected and Well program, we really were focused in on making sure that we were understanding the potential stresses for our people in their particular environment. So that might have been role uncertainty, changes in work demands and the environment. We certainly saw an increase in customer aggression and all of that coupled with physical safety concerns. You know, we had a lot of people that were coming to work every day in the face of great uncertainty and, you know, and knowing that there were people around them that had been sick, that had been exposed to the virus. That's, you know, we are a large workplace, that was going to happen. We are a reflection of the community in so many different ways. So making sure that we were cognizant of all those factors was a really big part of our strategy. And we looked at 4 critical areas of what we think would drive success in this space early on. So continuously looking at our needs, making sure we had strong leadership commitment, which we absolutely do at Post in this space, which is fantastic. We don't have to fight that battle. Our leaders are very much on board and they own this program. A really flexible approach as things moved and changed. And we really needed to move across our different departments and utilise resources across the spectrum, which was critically important. So we used everything from our Health and Wellbeing Champions Network, which is people out in the facilities, all the way through to our executive leadership team in almost every comms that went out, focusing on this as something that they spoke to really carefully. I might get you to flick on, please, Sandra. So if I talk to you a little bit about our post office network and our contact centres, one of the key risks that they faced in the context of really high work demands, you know, when there's that many parcels moving through the network and everything was delayed, we apologise. It was pretty tough there for a while, to the extent that, you know, people like me were out delivering parcels or sorting parcels in facilities. We were just trying to get things moving. But that comes with difficult challenges for our post office networks. They're the front facing where people will go in and you know, because their parcel hasn't arrived, and same for our call centre staff. So we retrained everyone around aggression de-escalation, customer service training, resilience training. We focused in quite specifically on topics that would be relevant in that space in our Healthy Me portal around the Keeping the Well approach. We wanted to really make sure we were supporting the 5 in 5 workers rather than the 1 in 5 that may have been at the left-hand side of the spectrum. Another really important point particularly for our post office network was moving really quickly on physical safety controls, and that had a massive impact on the psychological safety of our people. So putting barriers in place, getting the signage right, making sure that the social distancing was spot on in our post offices really helped our people cope with the fear that came along with being frontline staff in this environment. So we worked closely with those teams, and we saw, you can see some numbers there up on the screen around the sorts of interventions we put in place and how people were feeling coming out of it. Sandra, I'll get you to flick on to the next slide for me. I think the other group that faced enormous change was our frontline delivery workers. So early on in the pandemic, we really had no idea what was going to happen with our volumes. We were looking overseas and seeing that Italy, New Zealand, various other places, UK, they were seeing massive decreases in their workload and in their demands. It just was a disaster on lots of fronts there. So early on, we were worried that was going to happen here too. The opposite has happened, but we put structures in place, like our alternative day delivery model early on, to account for what that risk sort of looked like from a business point of view. And that meant for our metro areas, we were delivering mail every second day, which was fundamentally the biggest change that those workers had undergone in decades, really. So at the same time as they were faced with a global pandemic, and as increases in volume were coming through, they were also having really big changes in their work demands and lower levels of job control as this was sort of happening to them rather than with them. And we really needed to put some pretty significant support mechanisms around that process. So one of the key interventions we did was actually put in the states that we could and in the gaps that we could on-site EAP in place. So our delivery workers are large male workforce, older workforce, generally speaking, sitting within categories of people that are less inclined to exhibit help-seeking behaviours. And so we brought the help to them. Rather than have them seek it, we put it in front of them, and we heard some just story after story of people who would say, I would never normally call the EAP. I wasn't comfortable going to speak to somebody, but when there was someone there and on their site and doing a walk around and making that something that was not threatening, we had just enormous amount of uptake with that service, and it made a huge difference in terms of that protective layer for those teams. So in terms of where we're at now, we will continue to absolutely apply that integrated model as we move forward and look at what our the programs that we've got in place will be going forward. We're taking very much a tailored risk identification and mitigation approach to our psychological safety and mental health and wellbeing across the business. We will continue with on-the-ground EAP where we can in our delivery sites. And we're really pleased to see with our April, we did an April engagement survey, and we were seeing stats like 81% of people felt their work area was looking for better ways to create a safe environment, and 79% felt that their manager was always putting employee safety first despite urgency to get the job done. Those sorts of stats are critical in making sure that we are actually providing a psychologically safe work environment for our people. So we'll continue to push on as we go forward in the next stage of the pandemic, and we are incredibly focused on making sure that we're providing a psychologically safe environment for our workers, just as much as we are focused on making sure their physical safety is absolutely at the forefront of everything we do. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you very much. I wasn't sure whether to cut in or not. But Kim, thank you so much for sharing the experiences and insights that you have today from Australia Post's perspective. Really great to hear all the wonderful work that you've been doing there. So well done to you. We'd now like to welcome our second speaker, Dr. Laura Kirby, Chief Mental Health Officer at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Laura is an organisational psychologist with more than 10 years' experience specialising in workplace psychological health and safety. Laura joined the CBA in January of 21 as the Chief Mental Health Officer as part of the group's ongoing mental health strategy. Laura's role is focused on enhancing the group's strategic focus on mental health, which includes the prevention and mitigation of mental ill health at work and ensuring our workplace environments protect our people's mental health and enables them to thrive. The pandemic challenged CBA's entire workforce in a number of different ways. Laura will discuss how CBA responded to take a greater focus on psychosocial risk in the lockdown and hybrid work environment, as well as the proactive wellbeing strategies implemented over this time and how these are being taken forward. Welcome, Laura. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you very much for allowing me to speak to you today. I thought I would just spend a few minutes talking through some of the key reflections that we've had over the last few months. And as the intro mentioned, it was a challenging year and it continues to be across our group, but for many different reasons. And with such a diverse workforce, nationally distributed, our teams were impacted in very different ways. So I think one of the reflections for us where we had to transition a vast majority of our workforce into a work from home environment, but also looking at taking that hybrid working environment forward. I think in many ways this places a much greater focus on psychosocial risk, given that we're removing lots of exposure to the centralised physical workplace hazards, but the psychosocial ones remain. And in fact, they present in many different ways in that hybrid working environment. And so thankfully, this was a gap that the bank recognised before the 2021 lockdowns, and was actually part of the reason that I joined the group as the Chief Mental Health Officer. And as Martin mentioned, part of my role, or mainly my role, is to help enhance the group's strategic focus on mental health. And as part of that is really making sure that we have got the right tools and systems in place to aid our prevention when it comes to psychological ill health. And so a big part of that is making sure that we've got the right systems in place around psychosocial risk. And so one of the first things that I did earlier in the year was implement a robust psychosocial hazard framework and risk assessment process. And this is something that we've been utilising with businesses and teams across the group, so that we have a good understanding of the kinds of risks and challenges that they're facing, both from a BAU point of view, the inherent demands or challenges or risks that they would normally and ordinarily face, and that's inherent to their roles, as well as some of those pandemic influences and that point in time perspective. And of course, as you would expect, one of the findings there is that the challenges that different teams and business units faced were quite different. For example, in our customer-facing roles, not dissimilar to some of the experiences that Kim was sharing with us just now, but the emotional load for customer-facing and frontline roles who were supporting our national customer base, who in turn had their own challenges, which included themes around financial distress, escalations around domestic and family violence. There were much greater expressions of mental illness over this period of time as well. And so in these teams, one of the things that we undertook was a really targeted strategy around vicarious trauma that aimed to prevent and minimise vicarious trauma, and made sure that we had the right supports in place for our teams. Whereas for our enterprise and technology side of the business, as you can imagine, when you transition a large workforce over to a work from home environment, their work demand, particularly early on in that lockdown in New South Wales, was tremendous. And in these instances, some of the control measures that we had to look at implementing was really from that business unit focus around prioritisation and clarity, and making sure that we weren't adding projects to their list at this point in time and looking at whole scale changes, but making sure that they had the right focus and teams in place to close out those really urgent needs when it came to technology demands for the broader business. I think in addition to the business unit specific focus when working with a diverse workforce, I think more broadly, and again, this is something that Kim was speaking to, we follow a very similar model around that idea of protect, promote, support. And this was a time when I think the need to ensure that we were supporting all of our employees from a wellbeing perspective really came to the forefront. And acknowledging that so much of our workforce had many challenges, particularly in those lockdown areas across our eastern seaboard. Living in lockdown, living in isolation, juggling work and homeschooling or childcare responsibilities, even being removed from family who might live interstate or in fact overseas. And so these were challenges that were obviously taking a toll on people and adding to their overall sense of load and really influenced where they sit along that mental health continuum over this period of time. So one of the initiatives that we undertook quite deliberately was establishing what we ended up calling Wellness Awareness Week, which was simply a week dedicated to wellness activities through our central wellbeing portal, which is what we call Thrive. Now, Thrive has been a very deliberate strategy that's been built up over a number of years now. But the importance of Thrive being a centralised virtual hub really became even more pronounced over this time, in that we couldn't rely on engagements and offerings in the face-to-face in the centralised office environments. It had to be available to people at that point in time, whenever they needed, and accessible for them in the way that they wanted to use it. And so what Wellness Awareness Week allowed us to do was simply show offerings that were actually nothing above what is normally or ordinarily available to our people. We just condensed them into a week-long schedule so that we had something on at every working hour of every day for that week. And one of the key outcomes for that, for this particular initiative, was to simply increase awareness of our standard wellbeing offerings that people do have access to at any time that they need it. And so one of the outcomes we're able to measure from this was that we had a 500+% increase in utilisation with our Thrive portal following that initiative. And we've actually sustained that utilisation increase since August, which is when we held that Wellness Awareness Week. We also continue to evolve the offerings that are available on our Thrive portal, and that includes investment in an online wellbeing assessment tool that we've developed called A Better Day. This A Better Day tool allows employees to self-assess their current wellbeing and then provides them with targeted resources to support their improvement in areas of wellbeing where they may be currently deficient or just needing some additional support. So again, providing with that point in time need and really targeting to our individuals' needs around wellbeing supports, again in line with that promote and prevent and support piece. And really trying to tailor to where people might be at around that mental health continuum. I think in reflecting on that mental health continuum as well, there is a really important silver lining, I think, if I can talk in those terms, from the experience that we've had over the last 12 to almost 24 months now. And that is that we have simply had a much greater focus on wellbeing and really what's important, and recognising that we are all fundamentally human. And that as a result of that, we are all likely to move across the mental health continuum at different times. And certainly we saw, again, to echo some of Kim's experience, we saw a lot more people experiencing that sense of languishing and probably spending more time in a sense of survival mode as opposed to that thriving mode. And so as an organisation, I think it's really important for us to ensure that we are meeting people with what they need at the different points along that continuum. And so there's a lot of development and ongoing development and making sure that we have those resources that meet the full spectrum of mental health needs. And this was really reflected in some of the communications that we had. I think we took a very top-down as well as bottom-up approach over the last few months in highlighting and promoting mental health and wellbeing. And this is certainly something that we'll aim to take forward, even as we move out of lockdown into a sense of normality, if we can call it that. So I think there is great optimism for what we can contribute to our people's lives, as well as our customers and communities. And this has been something that's really captured well, I think, in the refreshed purpose for our organisation around building a brighter future for all, and something particularly from a health, safety and wellbeing perspective that we can really relate to and see our piece in, and feel like we're really building on some solid ground from this challenging year and capitalising on the way in which we've been able to respond to quite unprecedented circumstances, in just making sure that we are focusing on wellbeing and providing the right resources and supports. So thank you so much for allowing me the time to share that with you today. It's great to hear from some fellow speakers on this topic, and great to hear and see such a recognition given to a really important topic in workplaces. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was great to hear from you. You guys over at CBA have got a knack for landing a really catchy title for your initiatives, tools and strategies. I really like Thrive, for your centralised virtual hub. A Better Day was mentioned, and also building a brighter future for all. So I think you've done some great work in naming all your tools and support functions. So well done to you guys. I would now like to welcome our final guest speaker, Professor Kimberly Norris. Professor Norris is Head of Discipline, Director of Postgraduate Professional Training Programs in Psychology and Counselling, School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Tasmania. Professor Norris is a psychological scientist and clinical psychologist who works across academic research and clinical practice settings. Primarily based out of the University of Tasmania, her overarching research and academic interests are focused on maximising human health, wellbeing and performance in both normal and extreme environments. Her research interests include adaptation and resilience in both extreme environments, for example, forensic contexts, climate distress, Antarctica, space, and the FIFO workforce, and more normative environments, for example, academic settings and life events. Through her work, she develops new and innovative ways to provide psychological support for individuals in remote, rural, maritime and extreme environments and individual organisation and relationship levels. Please welcome Professor Kimberly Norris. Thanks, Kimberly.
Thanks, Martin. So thank you to everyone for making the time to be here today. And I think the fact that you are here speaks to the reality that we are all living through at the moment and trying to navigate. I think I have a real privilege speaking after both Kim and Laura insofar as they've beautifully summarised many of the challenges that many organisations have experienced, but also provided a lovely platform for me to be able to speak to some of the theory and evidence we have around this process. But before I go any further, I would also like to recognise and pay respect to the Indigenous Australians that are here with us today, as well as the traditional owners of the land on which I'm privileged to live and work, the Muwinina people of the past and the Palawa of the present. So I'll just ask Sandra if you could please move to the next slide. And the first question I have for everyone is to really have a think about how the pandemic has impacted people's mental health. So both Laura and Kim gave us some clues. You've no doubt had your own experiences or reflections, but I'm interested to see, maybe through a bit of a poll here, whether you think there's been no impact at all, whether we've seen an exacerbation of people who may have had pre-existing mental health conditions, whether the experience of this pandemic has in and of itself triggered mental health disorders or distress at least, or maybe it's all of those things. So I'm just interested for people to have a think, engage with that before we move on. Now, I know it may have been a bit of a giveaway. Normally it is one of those all of the above, none of the above questions. However, what we have seen across this pandemic is that there are some members of the community who report no observable impact of the pandemic on their mental health and wellbeing. Now, what we are recognising is that that's probably a small minority, but nonetheless, it is an important acknowledgement that some individuals report not having been impacted in terms of their psychological health and wellbeing. We definitely predicted and have seen very strong evidence to support the fact that those individuals who had pre-existing mental health conditions have experienced an escalation in the distress associated with those and the associated symptoms. Now, given that at any one time across the Australian population, we would expect around 25% or so of individuals to experience some form of psychological distress. You can imagine we're not talking small numbers here. And often these individuals who are attending work, engaging with their everyday practices with an existing mental health condition will experience difficulties daily, let alone when you layer the COVID-related challenges on top. And of course, particularly as both Kim and Laura were saying, we definitely know that a large proportion of individuals experienced some form of psychological distress. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they would have experienced high clinically significant levels, but definitely were impacted insofar as their ability to perform at the level they are used to and wanting to, or even just in terms of managing all of those simultaneous demands. So Sandra, if you could please move to the next slide now. Thank you. Now, the reality is many people across the country have actually experienced repeated experiences of isolation and sometimes reintegration. What we know is that regardless of the number of times you've experienced isolation, there actually can be benefits. And it's really important to recognise these benefits, both to reassure people, because sometimes they feel that maybe there's something wrong with them or they did the wrong thing if they liked parts of isolation. But more importantly, in speaking to those issues that both Kim and Laura brought up around the continuum of health and maximising the positives, is that if we know the good things, not only can we acknowledge them, but we actually can support people to find them in their own experience and learn and benefit from them. So one thing that I will acknowledge is that when we talk about benefits, we need to recognise that this is a salutogenic process. Now, basically just a fancy word that means for a lot of people, there would have been some good things at the very same time as there were bad things. So it's this understanding it's not good or bad, it actually can be a bit of both. And it's through these challenges of salutogenesis, so good and bad, that we know people are pushed beyond their previous levels of functioning, whether they like it or not. Now, for some individuals, that results in what we call a growth outcome. So in other words, once they've had an opportunity to recover, their performance levels, their sense of well-being, their recognition of their own values, their sense of identity, is much, much clearer and much stronger than if they had never had that challenge and never been forced to navigate those difficulties. So we do know that growth outcomes are very possible and in some people quite probable. We also know that when in isolation, people have more time to think. Now again, a double-edged sword, but considering how hectic most people's lives are most of the time, to suddenly have some of those external pressures removed. So for example, not having a work commute, or at least not as often, having fewer people in the workplace, if not working from home, suddenly creates mental space. Mental space to think about things like, who am I and what's important to me? And that idea of what's important to me is actually what we're starting to see in the workforce as they begin to re-enter or negotiate re-entry into more standard work conditions. When we're talking about the fact that people are starting to prioritise, for example, a better work-life balance or different expectations of their employer in terms of psychological health and safety, as well as physical health and safety. It's also interestingly why we're seeing it increase in the number of people committing to and reflecting on things like climate change and their role in protecting the environment. We also see the development of new perspectives, increased tolerance. And now I know for those of you who have experienced isolation, especially repeatedly with other people in the same household, you might say, oh, no, I have no tolerance left. Trust me on this one. The research is pretty clear that although in the short term your tolerance may have got shorter, in the longer term your ability to let go of the little things and focus your energy on the bigger things is much better developed. And of course the other component is an enhanced commitment to self-care. So recognising that at the end of the day, if you're not putting energy into you, then you haven't got the energy to perform or give to others in the way you would like or need to. So it really is quite a big shift away from this idea of very intense, very high level, super long work hours and engagement to I work often for enjoyment. There's a part of me that aligns or identifies with the work I do. How can I actually balance this in a more sustainable and healthy way? So if we can look at the next slide, please, Sandra. Now, the reality, as I said, is I'm not pretending it's all sunshine and daisies. I know firsthand that it's far from it, both from a personal perspective, but also from a research perspective. And so we do know that there are some fairly common challenges. And I'll just cover a few here, but many of you will already know these or even have others I don't touch on. but something to be aware of from an organisational perspective. So when we're thinking about supporting employees, supporting organisations, is that for many people, just as I mentioned a moment ago, work is a core part of their identity. It's how they define themselves. And to have a sense of loss around that, either because of a change to work conditions, a change to job role, can fundamentally undermine who am I and where do I fit in the world. And that then can be accompanied by grief processes, anxiety processes, and other really complex emotional responses. The other thing to remember, of course, too, is that for many individuals and for many different reasons, work serves as a really important place of escape. It's a place where they can leave maybe some of the challenges of their personal life behind. And for many, work is actually a safe space. And sadly, for some, they're only safe space. And so we need to recognise that as we're moving back towards business as usual or a revised business as usual, that we're going to have people who work used to be their safe space and now it's changed. And they'll need to find and be supported in finding how that works for them going forward. Roller coaster of emotions happen as well. You know, we talked about, Kim had that beautiful diagram of the inverted U, that continuum where people sort of rise and fall. And we know that people move forwards, backwards, sideways, all over the directions in terms of that continuum. But some pretty common mood fluctuations are irritability, anxiety, and feelings of helplessness. Now, what tends to happen is that irritability and anxiety actually take a lot of energy to sustain. And so as we're driving those emotions with energy, we essentially have to come to a point where we can't feel them anymore. And that's often where we fall into that sense of helplessness. So if we're noticing people within the employment sector seemingly quite emotionally labile up and down, it's actually a sign that they are moving along the continuum of wellbeing and actually deliberately engaging in that adaptation process, because you don't shift emotionally unless you're trying to adapt. The other thing that both Kim and Laura touched on was this idea of increased workload on your brain. Now, we call it cognitive load. And essentially, all of us have a finite capacity, how much we can hold in our brain, act on at any one time. What tends to happen is that for most people, most of the time, we're almost at our limit. We're functioning at that very, very high level, very little space left over. So when you bring the pandemic in, what tends to happen is people exceed their cognitive capacity, they exceed their brain space, and something's got to give. So because the brain doesn't always know exactly how to organise energy or direct attention and focus, what happens is it slows everything down to try and make room. So a lot of people, maybe yourselves included, will have talked or experienced memory declines. Like your memory just doesn't seem to be as good as it used to be. You can't keep things in your head anymore. Your ability to maintain attention and concentration will have reduced. Your ability to plan in a logical way reduces. And so does your processing speed, which is basically the ability to take in information, figure out what you need to do, develop the plan that goes with that, and then execute it. So that process takes more time. And as a result, we're pretty exhausted. We are pretty exhausted. And so some people will also say to you, I haven't been doing anything, but I'm exhausted. And it's because they're not recognising this cognitive load that they're trying to manage without even being aware of it. So again, that acknowledgement, that reassurance and validation. No, you've not been doing nothing. You've been navigating a pandemic. And that's something we are fundamentally at birth not wired for. So we are literally have been developing new brain structures, new neural pathways in our brain every time we've had to learn a new skill or adapt an existing skill to a new context in order to navigate the way forward. One final thing that I did want to flag, because this is particularly true when we think about workplaces that required people to begin working more remotely or in smaller numbers on site. And it's this idea that when there's not many people around us, at least people who are working in the same sort of industry, have that organisational knowledge that we do, we lose social comparators and also social cues. Now, social comparators and social cues are what we use to figure out if we're doing the right thing, if we're working at the right level, if we're on track. You know, you kind of have that glance around and see how everyone else is going, or you're looking for that feedback from people to say you're doing a good job, or listen, what I need you to do is go and revise this for this reason. And what tends to happen is that in the absence of social comparators and cues, so those reassurance-seeking mechanisms we have, people tend to overestimate what's being expected of them and underestimate how well they're actually doing. And as a result, we see anxiety increase. Now, given what's been happening globally, let alone nationally, where we have seen, unfortunately, a very large reduction in some capacities of organisations. We've seen voluntary and involuntary redundancies, we've seen job losses. What we're actually seeing is I can't actually gauge how well I'm going anymore, and I am so worried about losing my job at the same time that that anxiety that eventuates actually drives things like perfectionism and overcompensation. So we see people working even longer hours, not just because it's a little bit more blurry because, you know, work and home is the same thing, but because there is this genuine fear, I could lose my job, what will my family do? And so they're driving themselves into exhaustion. Now, the reality is, I think Laura said it beautifully, at the end of the day, we're all humans. And as humans, we all have a breaking point. So what tends to happen is, as a result of this overachievement, this overcompensation and anxiety, is that people burn out, that they become exhausted. And so what we see could be misinterpreted as a disengagement. So suddenly we see people not performing at the same level, or not engaging as regularly, or avoiding tasks or meetings. It's not actually that they're underperforming, and it's not that they don't care. It's actually that they've gone that other side of, if you like, the optimal level of performance. And they've become so overwhelmed and so exhausted that they've entered into a phase that some might call procrastination, that others might call disengagement, but it's a, if you like, an attempt at recovery. But because of the negative emotions that are happening at the same time, recovery doesn't happen that well. So something that we need to be aware of, we need to be supporting organisations to be aware of, is that if you're seeing people disengage, if you're seeing people withdraw or performance drop, that's normally a sign that either they are already burnt out or that they're very close to. So it aligns, if you like, with that languishing phenomena that Kim demonstrated in that curve earlier today. These people are at risk and actually are the most vulnerable because they still care. And so they're caught in that conflict between caring and being exhausted and not being able to reconcile the activities that need to keep occurring. If you could please move to the next slide, Sandra. Now again, I'm not going to spend too long on this particular slide, except to say that everybody will be at a different stage of reintegration, adaptation and recovery. And I know that both Kim and Laura have already acknowledged that because they're seeing it firsthand. Now, typically what tends to happen when people are released, if you like, from isolation back into the wild, you get a little bit of a honeymoon period. Energy spikes, people have that drive, and they're buoyed by the fact that things are getting back to normal. Things, can happen again. So they're kind of buoyed along by that honeymoon phase. However, the reality is that just because isolation has ended or restrictions are easing doesn't mean the challenge is over. And it doesn't often take very long before those challenges start to weigh in on the person again. And it could be something that we see as relatively simple, like, for example, trying to manage, the commute to and from work, the high level of communication or information traffic, managing other caregiving commitments that might be occurring. But increasingly, it's also that the organisation they're re-entering has changed. The world they remember actually doesn't exist. And so what happens is that they are now having to adapt to a new work environment, but one that their brain is trying to tell them is familiar. So it's both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. And as a result, that cognitive load issue starts to grow. Because normally, if something is predictable, then we feel fairly in control. And if we feel in control, we feel safe. And that safety allows us to open back up a little bit of cognitive capacity. However, if we move in and suddenly work is not as predictable, then our need for control goes up because we feel unsafe. And that increases demand on cognitive load, and we see those decrements along memory, attention, concentration, and more. Now, often what happens is at this stage, people start to feel really, really disheartened, because for many people, they would be really excited to get back to work, and they almost feel like they've been robbed of that excitement. This isn't what I've signed up for. And so what tends to happen is this up and down process of reintegration. There's excitement, followed by lack of energy, low mood. Then you start to adjust and you start to come back up and thinking it's okay, I've got this. And then maybe something changes at work again, or there's another outbreak requiring isolation, and you dip again. And so this up and down process, from the research we've done prior to COVID with other populations who routinely experience isolation, astronauts, Antarctic expeditioners, FIFO workers, we actually know that following a single period of prolonged isolation, so a couple of months, it can actually take up to a year to fully reintegrate. What we're actually dealing with at the moment is not a single experience of isolation. It's actually repeated experience of isolation without the opportunity to actually reintegrate in between. So we have a cumulative effect of these isolation experiences, which means we're most likely to see a little bit of a hangover effect, if you like, and we're going to see longer reintegration processes. And for some people, they go, what, a year? You mean I'm not going to feel myself for another year? Rather than feeling helpless at that, it's actually about providing ourselves the space and permission to be okay when we're not okay. That it's actually a very normal reaction to a very abnormal environment. And again, helping organisations, helping employees understand that that's an expected response can immediately decrease anxiety, because there's not something unusual about them. It's not that they're not coping. It's actually, this is the reality of the challenges they're facing. So if you can go to the next slide, please, Sandra. And so here's just another chance to think about your own experiences and how you're feeling about easing restrictions, recognising that depending on where you are in the country, your experiences will have been really different. For some, you might be really excited and looking forward to being in contact with others again. Others might share that excitement, but maybe a little apprehensive, maybe a little bit worried that it might all be taken away again quite quickly. Others are probably quite apprehensive, not feeling they're able to, if you like, trust that things can resume and continue. Some people might be genuinely quite worried. So just taking a moment to think about that. And recognising that every single one of those responses is valid, is appropriate, and simply reflects ourselves as individuals along a shared journey. If you can go to the next slide, please, Sandra. So as has been flagged earlier, I've done a lot of research in this area. I've been working in this area for around 15 years or so. And what we've actually found is that how well people adapt following isolation, following confinement, is actually not just about the person. It's about a really complex interplay between the person, the relationships they share with others, both very deep, close personal relationships, as well as broader social relationships, and the organisation. And you actually need to understand that it therefore requires processes at all levels, the individual, the relationship level, and the organisational level, to actually facilitate the trust that people need to have to feel safe, that leads to empowerment in their work role, and that empowerment, that sense of personal agency and trust that others are there to support you, is what actually leads to adaptation. Now, there's a couple of things I do want to point out here, and they were touched on, maybe not directly, but definitely indirectly by Kim and Laura. So they both spoke about dedicated programs within the organisation focused on wellbeing, but beyond that, that these programs were actively endorsed, promoted and engaged with by multiple levels of people in the organisation. So that those in the very senior positions were acknowledging the importance, engaging, and if you like, leading by example. That's what we're talking about when we talk about organisational climate. How safe and supportive is this workplace for those people? Because an organisationally safe space is one in which people feel safe enough to trust in their colleagues to provide them social support, in addition to the social support they receive from their private life. It also relies on information sharing and communication. If we are really clear with our employees about what to expect, what's coming next, what they can do, it allows for that planning. And planning equals predictability, predictability equals safe. The other thing I would like to acknowledge though is, and I'll touch on this in the next coming slides, is that although it's very tempting to focus on COVID and focus on the isolation and the confinement that we experience, the research we have is also very clear that some of the strongest predictors for how well you adapt following this type of event is actually not what happened during it. It was what was going on before the event and what happens afterwards. Now, we can't change what was going on before, but if you are working with an organisation that had some challenges and perhaps low levels of trust, that won't have improved just because there's been some time. That doesn't mean you're doomed. What it does mean is we really capitalise on this opportunity to focus on creating that safe space post-return from isolation, because that can reshape the dynamic going forward. Again, not just for the individual, but for those around them and for the organisation as a whole. So if you could move on, please, Sandra. So again, I want to flag that reintegration is traditionally one of the most difficult experiences of the whole isolation process. And one of the reasons it is because people think it's going to be easy. So they dramatically underestimate the level of work and effort that needs to be involved. And the next slide, please, Sandra. Thank you. Now, I'm hoping that this might be able to be made available to you later because I won't speak to every point. But the key points of this particular slide is that not every person will go through every stage of reintegration in the same way or at the same rate. And some people might even skip stages. Some people might move back through stages. We need to create an organisationally safe space for this to occur. And the next slide, please, Sandra. So we do, as I've already said, we'll have a mixture of people with a mixture of emotions. And that underestimation of the challenges of reintegration is often called reverse culture shock. So in other words, going back into an environment that used to be familiar, but the rules seem to have changed. It doesn't work exactly the same way anymore. And therefore having to readjust to something already new. So we do actually find a lot of social comparison happening at this time. Colleagues comparing themselves with one another. And sometimes this is to their own detriment, insofar as I'm not doing as well as this person. But sometimes it can also devolve into a little bit of a who had it worse scenario. So, well, of course they're doing better than me. Of course they're able to do more work than me because I was trying to balance this and this and this and this. Now, it's not that they actually hold ill will towards that other person. It's something we call self-worth protection. So in other words, they're trying to provide an explanation for why perhaps they're performing at a different level that doesn't risk their employment. Because remember that anxiety about the safety of their employment hasn't actually gone away. So if you can move to the next slide, please, Sandra. Something that can sometimes be really helpful to guide people through when trying to understand these differences in approaches are the 3 different types of, if you like, responses that can be happening post-return. And one is the observer. Now, the observer is someone who feels very, very threatened by their work environment, and they feel that everything is completely out of their control. So as a result, something will always be good or bad. There's no shades in between. And they tend to stand back and wait for change to happen because they don't feel like they have any control to influence directions anyway. So they're going to be much more passive. Again, it doesn't mean they don't care. It actually means they're at a level where they feel so overwhelmed and powerless that we need to be supporting them and empowering them to be an active member of the workforce again. Survivors are slightly different insofar as they believe that they're more at the mercy of circumstances that are out of their control. So rather than sitting back and waiting passively for change, what we do tend to see instead is that these individuals might be somewhat resistant to change. So they might push back a bit and maybe even become somewhat competitive because, again, they're trying to protect their sense of identity, protect their sense of self-worth, and sometimes that pushes them into that fight or flight space. Ideally, what we're trying to do is create a workspace that can facilitate the development of navigators. Now, navigators are these individuals who have developed or are in the process of developing a belief that they can cope. They know what their goals are and they're engaging in strategies to reach them. That they're taking action rather than waiting for action to occur. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Sandra. So what do we do? What do we do with this? The reality is that uncertainty is inevitable. So we can't promise our workforces that, everything's going to be completely predictable. But instead, we need to really encourage what we call cognitive flexibility. And that's the idea of entertaining multiple perspectives, seeing multiple possible processes, multiple pathways and outcomes at any one time. Because that actually gives you hope that, well, okay, path A didn't work, but I've still got B, C, D, E, F. It's actually much harder to do than it sounds, because it fundamentally requires letting go of the things we can't control and instead directing our energy into the things we can. Now, intuitively, our brain doesn't like that because it's wired for survival. And it thinks, no, you need to put all your energy, you need to focus on those things that can hurt you because it can hurt you. So we're actually asking the brain to work in a really different way. So again, it requires deliberate actions. And so I've got some strategies or some thoughts that could be worth pursuing in that organisational context. Okay. So routines, having some routines, not so rigid that if it doesn't go exactly according to plan, it's all thrown out the window, but enough that it feels like there are some clear boundaries in place. Acceptance that not everything's going to be great, but that doesn't mean nothing can. And this phrase I like to use, which is taking risks with purpose. Organisations have to evolve. They have to develop. That's how they survive. So if we're thinking about organisational change in a space where people are already feeling overwhelmed, be really clear, what is the purpose of this risk that I'm asking my team, my colleagues to undertake? And is now the best time for that purpose? Moving to the next slide, please, Sandra. So I'm going to leave you with this to return to, but it is again the fact that just like with the observer, the navigator, we're going to see some resistance to change. Change is not bad, but it's also not good. It's simply different. And so helping our workforce to entertain that idea, moving away from good versus bad to flow and different, can be very, very powerful. Moving on to the next slide, please, Sandra. So social support is key, and it's part of that trust development, but it's also been particularly challenging as people have been more removed from the traditional on-site working environment. So when we talk about trying to bring people back on site, if that is the organisation's goal, sometimes it can actually help to understand and maybe even communicate that this is not just about we want you back on site because we do, but because the research tells us that when you're in an environment with others who share goals, share values and understand your experiences, that can actually improve your own mental health and well-being, and as a result, your workplace performance. If you can please move to the next slide, Sandra. So some key questions that you might use or share with the organisations you work with is, what behaviours do I need to model? What can I do and where can I help? And it won't be everywhere, that's not your job. But the idea is, for example, modelling taking leave, modelling having a rest, modelling saying I need help. Critically thinking about situations. Now that doesn't mean criticism, but it means weighing up those pros and cons, being okay with ambiguity, and responding with empathy, because sometimes someone will behave in a way that maybe just really annoys us or we find really inappropriate or disappointing. We have to remember that all behaviour has a purpose. So when we see a behaviour that's misaligned with our organisational values or even our own personal values, taking that step back, employing empathy and saying, okay, what is the purpose of this behaviour? What is it this person is trying to get? What do they need? And how can we facilitate that? Because at the end of the day, we're talking about courage from every single one of our employees, including ourselves. If you can please move to the next slide, Sandra. So we're using clear contemporaneous communication, just per my earlier diagram. Okay. Because of that issue of cognitive load, and remember memory is not going to work so good, write things down. Okay. If you have a meeting, have written action plans, share them. And when there are large scale issues that have a degree of urgency, take some of the responsibility for making those decisions away from the bigger group and instead invite them into those smaller to medium or less urgent decision making. So they're still part of the process, but not with that intensity of overload. If you could please move to the next slide, Sandra. So I've got a range of other strategies here, but the big one is create opportunities rather than mandates to re-establish community in a graduated manner. You will try to do things and not everyone will turn up. That doesn't mean it didn't work. It means not everyone's at the same phase on that reintegration pathway. So you continue until people feel ready, and each opportunity, each gathering reinforces the organisation's commitment to supporting the workforce. The other thing too is if you're seeing that level of perfectionism and overcompensation, make sure you support individuals to set achievable and appropriate goals and expectations of themselves, but also others. And of course, wherever possible and appropriate, really supporting individuals to take leave because they haven't been on holiday. Okay? They've been doing more work than ever, and not just in the traditional workspace. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Sandra. Very briefly, I want to acknowledge the fact that leaders are not responsible, are not the sole people responsible for the well-being of everybody else. Please provide opportunities, but you cannot shoulder the sole responsibility. You need to, as leaders, acknowledge your own achievements. Make time to protect energy, activities that re-energise us. Notice I said make time, because you'll never find it. Take leave, and ultimately talk the talk, because that gives your staff permission to walk the walk. On to the next slide, please, Sandra. I've just included this slide as something you might want to refer to, as some ideas, because often people say, I don't know what to do. I don't know anything that, that re-energises me or rests me or relaxes me. There are just some ideas here. And some of these will work for some people, others won't. So the idea is have a toolkit that people can pick and choose from. And that way they end up with a personalised action plan supported by an overarching organisational framework. And if you can move on to the next slide, please, Sandra. The final thing I want to leave you with is this idea of self-complexity at both an individual level but within an organisational context. At the end of the day, we are more than employees. We are more than partners, we are more than friends, we are more than family. We have so many dimensions to who we are. So we need to nurture every one of those so that if, for example, work's getting a bit hard, we don't feel completely overwhelmed because we have this fallback safety net of, I still have my family, I still have my sport, I still have my hobbies. Now, it won't take the bad away, but it does provide some respite. And that's really what we're trying to do here. Remind people they are part of an organisation that cares, and they recognise them as individuals as well as teams. So thank you for your time today. I did go a little bit over, but hopefully it wasn't too far. So thank you again, and back to you, Martin.
Thank you so much, and it's absolutely fine that you went over for a few minutes. So thank you, Professor Norris. Please accept our sincere thanks for your time and expertise. Of course, we've got some Q&As to start with, but from a personal note, I also want to make reference to you talking about cognitive load. And from my own circumstance, I'd like to say thank you for providing me with an excuse for not keeping up with all the school notices that seem to arrive at this time of year. Thank you for that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We do have some questions, and we've got a few minutes to get to them, so I'll just pick at random and go for it. But I want to start by asking if there are so from your experience, and it's not necessarily just relating to your notes right now, but do you consider there are gender-based differences in the reintegration phase that you talked about, or are there differences between people who live alone versus those who live with others? No doubt there are some differences between personality types, but I was just wondering what your thoughts were, gender, people who live alone.
Absolutely. So, as I say, we are in a very privileged position, if you like, to have been doing research in this domain for quite some time. So we actually have found that there are some very clear gender-based differences in how people adapt following prolonged isolation. Now, I will preface this by identifying that the populations that we traditionally work with are primarily white men, fewer women, and even fewer individuals who identify as gender diverse. So a lot of the research I'm talking about, it will focus on those more heteronormative and gender normative experiences. However, what we do know is that stereotypically, following prolonged isolation, that those individuals who identify as males are much more likely to emerge with an increased appreciation of the role of social support. So they are much more likely to recognise and actively seek out that social support with peers, with family, with colleagues, and have a much better ability as well as motivation to work in a more dynamic way that's more inclusive. In contrast, we see that individuals who identify as female are much more likely to have carried a larger care burden during periods of isolation and can emerge more cognitively exhausted. But for those who were in a situation where they felt well supported or where they were able to be validated in their experience, we actually see those individuals start taking more positive risks in their careers. So they start nominating themselves more for promotions, they start actually trusting more in their skill set, and as a result having more confidence in that organisational context. So that's what we're finding in those gender-based differences. What we find in terms of people who've been living, isolated alone versus those who've been isolated with others, is that those who've been isolated alone are likely to have less opportunity to have had that reassurance, to have had that social support, because even though there's wonderful technologies now, talking through a camera is not the same as talking to someone face to face. And we actually know that when you're directly in a room with somebody, you can fire these things called mirror neurons, which means you're much more receptive to the emotional experience of somebody because you're sharing that information more directly. So individuals who've been isolated on their own are much less likely to have experienced that, and as a result are at an increased risk of distress. And some people have actually even argued that these individuals should be given priority to return to workplaces where there are still some restrictions on the number of people who can be there. In terms of those who've isolated with others, what we do find is that they are particularly keen to get back to work as a form of escape. So we do know there are very clear differences, but also that actually has some really important implications for the way, obviously, things like quarantine is managed.
Wonderful insights, thank you so much. I have some friends in a share house next to a construction site, and they're very keen to get back. I think the tension is high.
Yes.
I was really interested in the W-curve hypothesis model and the various phases that go in. What can employers do to meet the needs of staff during the different phases of that W-curve, acknowledging that they might go back?
I think one of the fundamental things organisations can do is actually have a set of policies and practices that accommodate the whole W-curve. So instead of releasing certain things at certain times based on the expected trajectory, so we think most people will be here by now, so we'll release this part. We think most people will release this part now, so we'll release the next part. Actually have those policies and practices available so that people can engage with the ones most relevant to their experience at the most relevant time. That actually aligns to a lot of research around just-in-time learning. So essentially, when it fits our needs and our motivations, we're much more likely to be receptive to it and learn from it than if it's kind of, if you like, cut and copy in front of us and trying to digest it. So creating your suite of resources, but having them available and allowing flexibility of when people engage and repeatedly engage is the best idea.
Thank you. I have a question from me this time. It's about resilience and relationships, and they go together. So if your social supports start to drop away during the isolation times, then how do we go about rebuilding them once we're out of isolation?
It's such an important question, and as you say, resilience and relationships hand in hand. What it is about is reflecting on which of those relationships put energy into me and which of those relationships only take energy out of me. And so this is why many people have expressed that as a result of isolation, they've really thought about their priorities in terms of who they spend time with. So in terms of reconnecting, it's about communicating to those you wish to reconnect with that they're important to you and that you'd really like to reconnect, but also having that cognitive flexibility to recognise they might not be ready yet. And that doesn't mean they don't care about you, and it doesn't mean you're not important to them. But what it means is that they're still transitioning at a level that's a little earlier in the reintegration phase than you are. So it's that when you get those types of responses saying, oh, listen, I'd love to, but no, or I'm not ready yet, or can we do one-on-one? Creating opportunities and reassuring them that those relationships are still there when they are ready. And if they are more comfortable doing one-on-one, and as long as you are, that might be the way to start. Because a one-on-one can be intense, but it requires less shifting, if you like, than a whole group of people. So you will best know the people around you, but stereotypically, individuals who are more introverted than others are probably going to require or desire smaller opportunities to start with, whereas those who are further along that continuum towards extroversion are probably going to be much more comfortable with larger gatherings because that's how they get the energy.
I think you referred to re-establishing community during this speech very well. So thank you. That's all we've got time for. We could talk all day, but thank you again, Professor Morris. I really enjoyed the presentation. I'm sure everyone did too, so thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Now, before we close off, I'd like to provide a brief Comcare update, giving you some insight into some of the things that were keeping us busy. Firstly, I'd like to mention some resources that relate to enhancing manager capabilities. We know that supportive and responsive managers help to bring down the stigma and discrimination surrounding mental ill health. The Enhancing Manager Capabilities project aimed to bring together better practice, research, resources and training to support the confidence and the competence of managers around the mental health and wellbeing of their teams. There are a total of 29 resources, including practice guidelines and training that are available on the Comcare Learning Management System and website. And the link has just been posted in the chat. These have been curated through engagement with several peak bodies, including the On Blue, Black Dog Institute, the Mentally Healthy Workplace Alliance and the Australian Public Health Service Commission. We'd also like to take the opportunity to remind everyone that a free and validated Australian psychosocial risk assessment survey called People at Work, which was developed in collaboration with the Australian Work Health and Safety regulators and leading researchers. People at Work psychosocial risk assessment tool helps identify key psychosocial hazards in the workplace and provides guidance on practical ways to manage them. It's a validated, evidence-based, robust and free for all Australian businesses. As you support your staff through the pandemic transition, please, this free tool can help ensure that you're asking the right questions and assessing the psychosocial hazards and risks that might be present or emerging in your own workplace. We've recently developed a new fact sheet about people at work that answers the most frequently asked questions about the tool. The team have just posted a link to this fact sheet in the chat. The People at Work website also features a detailed frequently asked questions page and plenty of resources that could be a tremendous support to you, and I highly recommend you take them forward. My final update is in relation to Comcare's efforts to support our jurisdiction to better understand and prevent workplace sexual harassment. As the Commonwealth's Work Health and Safety and Workers' Compensation Authority, Comcare is committed to supporting employers in our jurisdiction to create safe workplaces, including through education about ways to prevent and manage all forms of workplace bullying and harassment, including workplace sexual harassment. Earlier this year, Comcare worked with the Australian Human Rights Commission to develop and publish regulatory and practical guidelines on duties and obligations for employers, workers, managers and supervisors related to workplace sexual harassment. This guidance, which is available on Comcare's website at the link just posted in the chat, provides important information about what Comcare considers to be reasonably practical in relation to managing these workplace risks and suggests practical steps employers may follow in order to meet their work health and safety duties to employees and other persons. As well as developing these materials, Comcare recently hosted the Workplace Sexual Harassment National Forum in collaboration with Safe Work Australia and state and territory work health and safety regulators. The forum was focused on influencing positive change, and day one, which was open to the general public, focused on understanding the issues and the importance of prevention. The recordings are now available via the link that has also just been posted in the chat. We'd also like to highlight the Comcare Educations team work closely with the Australian Human Rights Commission to develop a suite of online and face-to-face training offerings in relation to this very important topic, which can be accessed via the Comcare If you have any questions about these initiatives or about any of Comcare's other projects, please do not hesitate to get in touch by emailing the Mental Health Program. The email address is also in the chat. Finally, and as a follow-up to the 3 Comcare National Safe Work Month webinars held in October, we will be hosting a Think Safe, Work Safe, Be Safe micro webinar tomorrow. That's Wednesday, the 1st of December from 1:30 to 2 p.m. and I would like to invite you to join. The registration link has also been posted into the chat. On behalf of Comcare and our attendees, I would also like to thank Professor Norris, Kim Grady and Dr. Kirby for their presentations this afternoon. I would also like to thank you all for attending this event and hope that it has helped you reflect on the COVID learnings for the workplace and how to utilise them going forward. Your feedback is important to us and shapes the way we deliver our events, providing valuable input towards the themes and topics we present. A short evaluation survey will be sent to all attendees straight after the event. But if you are able to complete the survey now, please click on the link that was just posted. Again, thank you for joining us today. Have a great afternoon and stay safe. Thank you.